School lessons will be broadcast in Te Reo and English from mid next week, and hard copy lesson packs will be delivered to tens of thousands of homes if needed. The government's also expanding access to digital learning for those who don't already have it, with 17,000 devices on order or waiting to be handed out. Its aim is for every household to have at least one option for distance learning when Term 2 starts and the country is still in lockdown. To explain how it's all going to work, I am joined now by Education Minister Chris Hipkins. Minister, the fact that you're putting so much effort into preparing these lessons, does that mean at the end of the lockdown you're still expecting some schools to be closed?
It means that we're planning for every possible scenario. At this point, I can't give you a fixed time around when schools and early learning services will be reopened, but it's likely that it won't all happen at once. It's not like we're suddenly going to push a button and everyone goes back to school or back to early learning. It's likely to be a phased process, and so we're planning for every scenario so that regardless of how long kids are at home for, we can make sure that they can continue to learn.
Will the government dictate that phasing, as you call it, or will it be up to each school to decide when they open?
No, the government will be playing a very active role here, and that will be based on health advice. It'll be based on making sure that when kids go back to school and go back to their early learning services, that they can do so safely.
So some regions at the end of lockdown and level 4 may still have to keep their schools and early learning closed.
Look, we'll make those decisions based on health advice. We're working through the various scenarios, and that includes being very clear about what the thresholds are when schools and early learning services would reopen and what the criteria would be if we're keeping them closed. Obviously, we had a process in place for escalation of the response. As we move out the other side, it's not necessarily going to be a direct reversal of the previous criteria. So we are going to make sure that we're making good decisions that still keep kids safe, keep the people, the teachers, and the other adults in that environment safe, and make sure that we're stopping the spread of COVID.
Understand, but in terms of managing parents' expectations, would it be realistic to say that we can kind of expect on again, off again with schools, maybe for the rest of the year?
Look, I wouldn't go so far as to say for the rest of the year. I would say that certainly don't expect schools and early learning services to be suddenly reopening all at once at the end of level 4.
How long are you planning for, though, Minister? If not till the end of the year, how long are you planning for closures?
At this point, we're planning for every possible scenario. So that includes having kids at home for an extended period of time. Obviously, I want kids back in classrooms and back in their early childhood services as soon as we can. But we can only do that when it's safe to do so and when their health is not at risk and the health of others is not at risk as a result of that. So at this point, I cannot give you a clear time frame. All I can say is that we're planning for every scenario.
So give us a quick overview of what these two education channels are going to look like.
So we're going to have 2 television channels, one in English and one in Māori, and they're going to be delivering educational content directly to people at home. They'll have content for different age groups. So early in the morning, for example, it's likely that we'll start with stuff targeted at young kids in that early childhood, early learning bracket, and then probably moving up through the age brackets as the day goes on. It'll include a mix of existing video content that we've got access to and some new content that will be produced specifically for these channels.
How many hours a day?
We're looking at sort of 6 to 8 hours a day of content that will be available. There's potential that some of that content may be repeated. So it's really important that we're getting kids good quality content. As I said, we've got access to really good video resources at the moment, but not everyone can access that using the internet. How
long do you intend on sustaining that?
At the moment, we're gearing up for a month, but
that's longer than the lockdown, isn't it, Minister?
Well, that's right, but we've got the ability to extend that as well if we need to.
Okay, so you've got about 80,000 households you mentioned that don't have access to online learning. How many of those do you expect you'll be able to get hooked up during this time?
Well, there's two factors here. One is whether we can get broadband to those houses, and there's two things that constrain us. One is whether we can get the network to them, and the second is things like modems, and we just have a limit to the amount of hardware that we can get out there. For example, we've got 2,000 routers or modems going out there as we speak this week, but our capacity to scale that up is limited based on the physical availability of the kit that we need. And then we've also obviously got the issues around devices. We've sourced an additional 17,000 devices that we can get to the kids who need them. We're also working with schools so that they can free up some of the devices that will be sitting in classrooms currently underutilised or not utilised at all while the schools are closed,
right,
and see whether some of those can be put out there. But let's be realistic about it. We are not going to be able to, in the space of a couple of weeks, have all of those 80,000 households connected.
So what's your goal then? Understand that you can't, for some logistical reasons, for the lack of modems, but you must have a kind of rough target that you're aiming for. Of those 80,000 houses, how many do you reckon you'll be able to get online?
Look, I think at this point I can't put a particular number on it. We're going to move as hard and as fast as we can. It's going to depend on our ability to source other gear, and also, even when you order the gear, actually getting the gear into the country creates some logistical challenges at the moment as well. So I'm really not going to put a number on that. What I am going to say, though, is that for those who we can't get connected, we're making sure that we're producing hard pack materials, physically printed materials that we'll be shipping out. So we've got 20,000 hard packs going out this week, another 40-odd thousand going out next week, and ultimately we've got the capacity to produce up to 500,000 of those, so that we can make sure that if kids can't get online and can't get on the internet, they're still going to have materials to learn from.
NCEA students might be particularly concerned about the situation here. So what can you say to reassure kids who are doing practical subjects like photography and other subjects which, well, realistically they might not be able to do at home? Are they going to be disadvantaged?
Look, we'll be working, and schools are working so hard to ensure that those kids are not disadvantaged. Our first priority for the allocation of additional resources are those kids who have got NCEA assessments and exams coming up this year. We're pulling out all the stops to make sure they get everything that they need. Schools are working really hard. I know some schools are already planning things like catch-up classes and so on to help those kids, catch up for lost ground that they may have had during this lockdown period. We're accelerating plans to make sure NCEA exams are available online for everybody who needs to have their exams done online. That work is already well underway. That's been happening over several years, and we're really putting the foot to the accelerator on that at the moment. We don't want these kids to be disadvantaged because of the lockdown.
We're almost out of time, but very quickly, I see that some integrated schools have applied for wage subsidies. So parents are wondering whether they should have to pay full fees because they've got income issues as well. What's your expectations around that? Should they have to front up with all the money or get some of it back?
It would be private schools rather than integrated schools, because for the teachers in state and state integrated schools, they're continuing to be paid. The government pays those salaries, and we're continuing to pay those. So they don't really have any reason to apply for the wage subsidy. And similarly, for all the support staff, we're continuing to pay those salaries as well.
So the schools that are getting the wage subsidy, what's your feeling on fees?
Well, for the issue of private schools, obviously more or less 100% of their income comes from parental fees. So, that's really a matter for them. I would expect that they're not double dipping and that they're not asking parents for more than they need in order to tide themselves through this period.
Appreciate your time. That is Education Minister Chris Hipkins.